2 years ago on Sabadi Archipelago, 11 rookie pirates appeared, each with a bounty of over 100 million berries, resulting in an incident of historic proportions. To summarize very briefly, this dude was punched by that dude, resulting in a third dude being called down from the sky to beat up all of the dudes, but all of whom managed to escape and went on to become known as the worst generation. However, this was not the original worst generation. They were simply the worst so far. And there is a whole legacy generation that came before them who I refer to as the first worst. This original generation was birthed rather appropriately in Logtown, also known as the town of the beginning and the end, which couldn't be more true in this case, as 24 years ago saw the end of Goldie Roger and the beginning of the first worst generation. 7 rookie figures gathered to witness this event, and during the next 2 decades, they would go on to turn this world upside down. This is the story of the awkward middle generation of One Piece. Because when we talk about generations, we have a tendency to focus on either the era of legends, the ones with your Rogers, your Whitebeards, and your pile of rocks. It's that, or we focus on the soon-to-be legendary generation of the Luffys, the Laws, and the other one, generally ignoring that there was an entire middle section between them, the meat of this generational sandwich, because they were the people who defined the golden age of piracy, people who formed rivalries, formed alliances, and toppled the previous generation into submission, with each and every one of them present at this snapshot in time 24 years ago, starting with the one and only Shanks, with the phrase the one and only also going on to describe Shanks's arm status. But Shanks is the Luffy of the first worst, the undisputed leader, the first to reach all of the massive milestones, like crossing the billion-berry bounty mark and even ascending into emperorhood. However, during this moment 24 years ago, Shanks was a mere 15 years old and crying his little eyes out, much like a village boy who just seen his mentor's arm eaten by a very hungry fish. Despite that, Shanks went on to take his place beside Big Mom, Kaido, and Whitebeard, 3 members of the legendary generation, who all looked down upon him, both figuratively as their junior in the great game of existence, but also quite literally because he was very short compared to them. They're big. God, they're big, so big. But just look at where we are now, 24 years later, and Shanks is the last one of them standing. To contrast Shanks' tragedy, another young boy was absolutely beaming when Roger was executed, a young incarnation of the viciously flamboyant Don Quixote Doflamingo, who was a mere 17 years old, which is actually the same age as Luffy was when he became a member of the true worst generation. And this was long before Doflamingo occupied Dressrosa, killed Rocinante, or did anything of any real relevance other than shoot his father in the head. However, he would go on to become one of the most powerful pirates in the world, not necessarily through strength having and fight battling, but more so through networking. This is how you network. Doflamingo's bounty may be a mere fraction of Shanks's eventual 4 billion, but his influence was equitable. Doflamingo had complete command of the global underworld and also managed to trap the collective nutsack of the world nobles into a vice, managing to blackmail and control the world government itself. And what he was lacking for in power was made up for with power, because Doflamingo had Kaido backing him, essentially giving our Pink Bird man the strength of an emperor, the political power of the world government, and the nefarious options of the underworld. To this day, I don't think there has ever been a more singular influential pirate. Not even an emperor was able to pull the strings of the world in the same way that Doflamingo did. And I love that he was smiling when the first worst formed, because in Roger's death, what Doflamingo saw was opportunity. In this moment, he saw the future instability of the world and decided that he would take full advantage of it. He's a pretty bad dude, and that's why he's given the designation of the worst. And I would actually equate Doflamingo to a more successful Capone Gang Beige, a ruthless businessman determined to dominate the world. But ruthless domination isn't exactly a unique characteristic within the first worst. Our third member was 19 years old when Roger was executed. His name was, and still is, Dracule MIHAWK, who appears here pre-facial hair, and evidently, eventually, decided to turn his sideburns into front burns, thus discovering the wonder of the moustache. MIHAWK is a great example of first worst rivalry, specifically with Shanks. These 2 rookie pirates continuously pushed each other to get stronger and stronger and eventually sit at the very tippy top of the planet. As the world's greatest swordsman, the argument can be made that MIHAWK is actually the most successful member of the first worst, being one of the very few characters in the entire series who has achieved their goal and who has spent modern day One Piece perpetually bored by the lack of endgame content in his life. He also went on to become the second most valuable member of the first worst, with a disgustingly high bounty of 3.59 billion berries. And interestingly, at the execution, MIHAWK isn't crying like Shanks, nor is he laughing maniacally like Doflamingo. Instead, MIHAWK is making a completely neutral facial expression, as if he's at an art gallery and he knows that the work in front of him has some sort of meaning, but he just doesn't quite get it. So he continues to stare aimlessly and question his life's choices of visiting the gallery to begin with. MIHAWK knew that Roger's execution was an important cultural moment, but he'd still rather be home right now and read about it later. MIHAWK also remains one of the few members of this generation who has yet to be toppled and torn from his first worst pedestal, although we do have a certain Zorro rabidly salivating to do just that. We also have quite a few members who have received the blunt and heavy end of this generation stick and been repeatedly bludgeoned in the skull with it. Our prime example being one Sir Crocodile, who is 22 years old, and unlike all of our other first worst members so far, he is the only one whose face we don't get to see at all during the execution, which is a key factor in fueling the idea that Crocodile was once a woman, but we don't need to go there in this video. If I had to bet, I'd say that Crocodile was definitely more on the Doflamingo scale of emotions, because Crocodile himself did pursue the dream of becoming the Pirate King after all. However, he was met with what I would describe as a Basil Hawkins series of failures. In his younger days, Crocodile's dream was first crushed by Whitebeard, who delivered Crocodile's famous facial scar, and may also very well have dehanded his hand. But did Crocodile give up? Nah. So he came up with a new plan to revive an ancient weapon and ascend to sandy glory. And that ascension would eventually occur. But unfortunately, it was due to a series of punches by a rubber man, thus crushing Crocodile's dreams a second time. But did Crocodile give up? Well, yes, temporarily. After this, Crocodile decided to remain in prison and have a bit of a think about what he'd done. But after that, he emerged back into the world with a whole new and accidentally clown-related plan to go for gold a third time by spearheading Cross Guild. Come to think of it, is it insensitive to say spearheading, given that Crocodile's head was speared? I'm gonna go ahead and say no. Oh, and speaking of no, here's a fun fact that I guarantee most of you will not know. According to volume 10,089, yes, it's a real book, Crocodile fought One Piece Stampede villain Douglas Bullet 2 years prior to Roger's execution, and this fight ended in a draw, which I call absolute BS on. There is no way the Crocodile stood up to even a young Douglas Bullet. But it's all non-canon anyway, so it doesn't matter. What matters is that after decades of struggle, spearheading plans, and being speared in the head as a result of said plans, Crocodile has achieved global infamy with a bounty of close to 2 billion berries. He really is the ultimate story of inspiration. No matter how many times you fail, do not give up, because maybe one day you too will have the pleasure of serving under a clown. Speaking of, Buggy the Clown is our 5th member of the first worst, as he was present during the execution, being a mere 15 years old, just like Shanks. And he was also crying, just like Shanks, and now he's an emperor, also just like Shanks. If Crocodile is the ultimate story of perseverance, then Buggy is the ultimate tale of equality. It doesn't matter how stupid you are or how red your nose is, you too can become a global military leader in just a few simple steps. Emperors hate this man because Buggy the Clown shows that their system doesn't require strength, talent, or even hard work. And you too can become an emperor by signing up for Buggy's Pirate Success course, link in the description, because that is exactly the sort of thing he'd do. That's what all people with no substance do. They try to sell you an online course. From the perspective of the world though, Buggy is a lurking legend who only made his presence known during Impel Down, and since then has rapidly risen to be considered an equal of Redhead Shanks, and has been granted a bounty of over 3 billion berries. And in true Worst Generation style, he has now made an alliance with 2 of his fellow First Worsts. And yeah, arguments can be made about whether or not Buggy actually deserves his success or his place in this group, but they're all wrong because the answer is simply yes. To a clown of a different sort, our 6th and penultimate First Worst is Gecko Moria, who was a sprightly 26 at the time of Logtown, and was also featuring smiling maniacally, seeing an opportunity in the commencement of the golden age of piracy. Unlike Doflamingo, however, Moria failed to capitalize on said opportunity, and actually it's quite sad, because barely a year after the golden age of piracy began is when Gecko Moria fought Kaido on Wano, where his entire crew were murdered, and all Moria took away from this experience as a souvenir was rather appropriately a corpse. Moria's pursuit of his dream was so unfortunately fleeting, and I think that this is what would have happened if the Straw Hats decided to go into the New World instead of training for 2 years. Moria is ultimately the least accomplished member of the first worst, but even then he did become a warlord, so that is something, and strangely enough he does have one very unique title, which is that he is the only character in all of One Piece to have captained two separate pirate crews, the Gecko Pirates and the Thriller Bark Pirates. However, that's only because his entire first crew were killed, so it's not really a badge of honor. With that said, Moria is a very persistent creature and remains active to this very day. Even though he's serving under a member of the True Worst generation, there is still time and opportunity for Gecko Moria to show why he is considered to be one of the original worst. He is not finished by any means, and neither are we, because we still have one very important member. This man is not a pirate, but as far as the world government is concerned, he's even worse. His name is Monkey D. Dragon, and he was present for both the execution of Goldie Roger, as well as the intended execution of his son, Monkey D. Luffy, at the exact same place. Dragon was 31 years old at the time, thus making him the elder of the first worst. And it is interesting that Dragon showed up at all, given that the world of piracy doesn't really concern him. However, if a Dragon Rock's connection is ever made, then I can certainly see him rocking up to pay respects and or pay his vitriol to Roger. But the thing is, you don't need to be a pirate to be considered one of the worst. Diaz Drake proves that as a member of SWORD, even if he was masquerading as a pirate. Doesn't matter. The thing is that Dragon is officially recognized as the world's worst criminal, thus making him the best of the worst because he is dubbed the worst of the worst, and when you're one of the worst means the best. Also, did you know that Dragon's voice actor recorded a spoken word song called Kakume no Senkusha? I hope not, because it's pretty bad. Dragon's voice is not suited for music in any way, shape, or form, and this may be controversial, but I legitimately think it may be the worst song ever recorded by a One Piece voice actor. And I'm including Damaro Black's We Were in that as well. But look, having the worst song is also very fitting for Dragon's worst title. And even though we're not aware of Dragon's bounty yet, the entirety of the first worst have a combined bounty total of at least 13,452,000,000 berries. So they're currently worth more than the entire True Worst generation. But most shockingly, all 7 members are still active. Whether they've risen to the top or simply kept afloat in the great backwash of existence, this whole generation is ready and actively going to participate in the eventual climax of One Piece.